Welcome to this podcast on the 2016 Development Workshop summaries. And in this section, we're going to be talking about recruitment issues and some of the problems associated with recruiting riders into the sport and what we might actually do to try to enhance recruitment. So based on information that was provided by Derek Bouchard Hall at the coaching summit this past November, what we find is that there are a number of different marketing trends that are changing why and how cyclists are getting involved in competitive athletics. And this is specifically going towards the membership decline at USA Cycling. What they're finding is that there's a real challenge in terms of being able to host events. They're becoming very expensive. There's a lot of permitting fees, a lot of challenges associated working with various entities around the state and around the country. We're losing a lot of venues, a lot of really good road courses, even criteriums are being lost. There's the cost of actually running the events is going up by quite a bit. The other part of this, I don't necessarily agree with everything in here. We'll talk about why that is in a minute. But what Derek provided was information suggesting that there's a plateau of growth in cycling in general, and I'll talk about my views in a second. Historically, USA Cycling has relied on large numbers of new members getting into the sport, and that is not happening quite to the same extent as in the past, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then there's another component here where cycling has become the new golf. It's a very lucrative sport for people involved in marketing and in a variety of different types of industries, and it's a way of socializing within the workplace. And that's not growing to the same extent that it was before. In the past, there was a romanticism associated with bicycle racing, and that has fallen off due to a variety of issues. Chief among those has been people like Lance Armstrong, who were a real magnet for the sport, but then turned out to be kind of a Trojan horse and led to a lot of other problems, and so people have been leaving. And this leads to the idea that there's a doping albatross associated with individuals like Lance. There's a lot of concerns about safety while racing on the road, and these are not unfounded. There have been a number of deaths during events, and there's been other types of concerns associated with being on the road with vehicles and things like that. And we're trying to overcome those, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. There's also been a large shift in terms of the types of participation where people want to get involved with mass start events such as Grand Fondos, gravel grinders, and sportives. And these are somewhat similar to traditional century type events, but they usually have a better hook than a regular century. Things like Strava and Swift have also drawn away market share to a certain extent, but they're much more individualistic in terms of how they're actually operating. This shows the trends in terms of the value indexed to 2010. What you can see is that the total ride and training participant days, which is on the upper end here, there was rapid growth over a few years, and that's somewhat plateaued between 2013 and 2015, but that looks like there's a rising trend again. So this is total ride and training participant days, and that's climbed by over twofold. The number of total ride and training events seems to be, it's climbed up about by 50%, and that's kind of plateaued over time. But the total number of race memberships really hasn't changed all that much. I mean, there was a small bump up in 2012 to 2013, and that's diving down a little bit now. And so that's what we're trying to remedy, is how do we capture individuals that are involved in cycling, that are riding and training, but yet they're not involved in competitive athletics for one reason or another. So we need to make our sport, or the sport of competitive racing and riding, more accessible to the general population. And this is where I think Derek's a little off base, because there are a lot of people out there riding bikes. They're just not involved in competitive athletics. So what will we be doing within the SCNCA? How will we be trying to target these things and be working to bring new individuals into the competitive side of road racing, and as well as track racing? And track has actually done a fairly good job of that here in Southern California, though we won't be talking about that as much. The first thing is that we are trying to help local clubs with knowledgeable mentorship and coaching. We're, from my end, is I'm really pushing individual clubs to have club coaches and provide better access to suitable mentors within their own organizations, or get them linked up with people that can help them. We're developing formal skills development programs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the development programming component. The toughest one that we're coming up against is trying to increase the sexiness of the skills-based program. In Northern California, the Early Bird Series has a very good basis within the region, and so they're able to draw quite a few individuals out to that every year. They get between 300 and 500 out to individual events, whereas the various events that we've held down here in Southern California, we can't seem to get more than just a few dozen. So it's a much different. We're just not able to capture that audience yet. And that's just something that we have to work on down here. I'm not sure if it requires a name change to the programs, and we'll talk about more about that, or we need to try to enlist assistance from advanced riders to help sell the programs, and then getting all the coaches on board with using those programs to help their ridership, which also has not happened yet. We're having some issues with getting all of the teams and coaches on board with using these programs, and I'm not sure how to overcome all of those issues yet. On the recruitment side, the scholastic programs, the NICA-based programs, National Interscholastic Cycling Association, they've done a very good job. They have over 1,000 riders within Southern California, and they have about an equal number in Northern California. And those programs, I don't have the data embedded in here, but those programs are growing at a very rapid rate, and we had a fair bit of discussion about that. It seems that the programs that are teacher driven have better recruitment than those that are driven by external parents and coaches. So that's something that needs to be thought of when we go out and try to recruit new individuals, especially juniors, is that if we can do this through a scholastic division with partnerships with teachers embedded in individual schools, is that we'll have a much greater likelihood of success. Another thing that was brought up during the national conference in Colorado by Kristen Dreifenbach was the idea that you need to have suitable mentorship and role models for riders, and associated with that, the basic element is to have the mentors be just very accessible for the individuals. And so when we're dealing with young riders, is you potentially want to use slightly older juniors who become role models for those younger riders. And then for the older juniors is to actually use collegiate riders and not necessarily have the high-end professional riders acting as the role models, but somebody that's much more accessible and somebody that's closer to their own age. The other part of this that was brought up at the national meeting this year was the potential of modifying club organization, especially at the junior level, with a refocus on how clubs are actually organized and moving towards what would be considered a more traditional sports model, much more like what is done in soccer leagues and in things like Little League. So in terms of cycling club models, when we think of cycling club models, this information was provided by the Connecticut Cycling Advancement Program at the national conference, is that typically when you think of traditional sports, is that the child will enter through a local organization such as a Little League. They will be recruited through some sort of active pathway. Then they will get involved with school-based programming, and then they will also be involved with local travel teams, and then eventually they would be going to college and hopefully continuing their participation, though that's not always the case. However, when we think of our local cycling communities and the local cycling clubs, they don't operate along the same kind of pathways. The child, the junior, can be involved with what would be considered a traditional cycling club. It would, in this case, they show a local masters club because that's what comprises most of the sport. Or they can get involved with a junior travel team. And when we think about cycling in its context, is that any child that gets involved with a cycling club and wants to compete is instantly put into a situation where they have to travel to go to events. They don't have events hosted in their hometown unless they're very, very lucky. They're going to be having to travel sometimes great distances to get to events. In Southern California, the closest events to us in Redlands are about half an hour, and those are only several during the course of the year, except for ones that we put on by our own club. And last year we put on about 25 different events here in Redlands, which helps overcome some of that barrier. But you can clearly see that from what they've laid out by the CCAP is that there's a vast difference between what would be considered a traditional sport that most parents will gravitate to versus what is done in cycling, where things are completely different. So what the CCAP organization has done is they've developed school teams, and this would be somewhat similar to the NICA type programs. And then those kids can then go on to regional club teams, and sometimes they work in parallel with one another. And then the kids that aspire to race more can go on to a junior travel team, and then they can move into, as they age up, they can move to a college team or to the CCA Pro-Am team. And in fact, CCAP just started an actual professional team this year, so they're really moving their kids through the pathway. So this is a great new tool that they have available to them from bottom to top as they can develop athletes. In terms of a traditional type of cycling club, is that you have a coach or a parent or teacher who runs a whole variety of different things. And because of that, they get stretched very thin, and it becomes very difficult to manage all the different elements. And when we look at how CCAP is organized, it's organized much more akin to what we have at the local association level, is that they have a large organization with a very large budget that actually runs events, recruits riders, deals with all the legal components, gets all the permissions done, handles all the sponsorship, handles all the practice locations. And then they have a coach, parent, or teacher who that then integrates with the organization to run practices and schedules and manages their own team. So this is much more like how ASO operates also in general, how ASO handles the fields and handles all the other issues, but then the coach just handles the athletes and make sure that they do what needs to be done in order to practice and go to events and things like that.